right, so U.S. history. Like, where even to begin with this? We're talking a huge chunk of time, events that shaped, well, pretty much everything.
It's a lot, yeah, but that's what makes it so fascinating, right? You can dig into, like, almost any aspect and find these crazy connections to stuff happening today.
Okay, so for this deep dive, before we get too lost in the details, what's your angle? What kind of stuff from U.S. history gets you fired up?
For me, honestly, it's always people. Like how one person's choice can snowball into this huge historical shift. We might not always see it at the time, but
Yeah, those ripple effects, right? And looking at the sources you sent, you've got some good ones here, like real deep cuts I was reading about.
oh, were you already into the early stuff, like pre-Civil War?
Yeah, I kind of had to start there, right? Sets the stage for everything else. It's crazy how, like, one issue, slavery, just tears the nation apart.
It's the core conflict, yeah. But also, it's not out of nowhere. We got to go back even further. See, even from the start, there's this tension. States' rights versus the federal government.
Built-in drama from day one. And then the Mexican-American War throws fuel on that fire.
Yeah.
1846 to 1848, right? U.S. wins, gets a bunch of land, but then it's like, okay, now what? Free states, slave states.
And suddenly, every decision is huge EE. You get compromises, like in 1850, trying to appease everyone. Didn't really work, did it?
Yeah, not for long. Then there's that Kansas-Nebraska Act. Like, let's let the people decide. Popular sovereignty. Sounds good, right?
Except it backfires spectacularly. Violence, chaos, proof that sometimes, even with good intentions, the system just ain't ready for that kind of change.
And then, bam, Dred Scott decision in 1857. Supreme Court says, basically, enslaved people, no rights, not citizens no matter what. Just, wow.
It's a gut punch, right? And it's not just about Dred Scott himself. It's about the message it sends. Abolitionists are horrified. Tensions are at a breaking point.
Country's on a knife's edge.
Right.
And then this guy, Lincoln, comes out of nowhere, gets elected in 1860, didn't even appear on the ballot in some southern states.
But his platform, his stance on slavery, that's what seals the deal for the South. They secede, form the Confederacy, and by 61, we're at war.
The Civil War, just saying it out loud, it's like the weight of it.
Yeah.
Brother against brother, 4 years of brutality. The names alone, Grant, Lee, Lincoln, of course. It's all so heavy.
You can't not feel it studying that time, and it reshaped everything, obviously. The political landscape, the very soul of the nation.
Okay, but mid-war, 1863, Lincoln drops this bombshell. The Emancipation Proclamation. I gotta admit, growing up, I thought that freed all the slaves right then and there. Not so simple, huh?
That's strategic, It only applies to Confederate states, places already rebelling, but it shifts the narrative, the moral high ground. The war's not just about preserving the Union anymore. It's about freedom.
And then finally, 1865, war's over, Union wins.
Yeah.
But then, just like that, Lincoln's assassinated. Man, what a blow after all that.
Right. It's like you almost can't process it. And it makes you wonder, what if he'd lived? How would Reconstruction have played out differently?
Okay, so that's what we got to talk about next, right?
Yeah.
Reconstruction, 65 to 77, South's in ruins, millions of formerly enslaved folks are now free, but what then?
It's a mess. Huge GE potential, sure, but also huge GE problems. You got presidential Reconstruction, more lenient, versus radical Reconstruction, aiming for like a total societal overhaul. Big clash of visions there.
And smack dab in the middle of it, these amendments get passed. 13th, abolishes slavery, thank God. 14th, everyone born in the U.S. is a citizen. Boom. 15th, black men get the right to vote. Seems like, okay, we're good now, right?
On paper, maybe. But out in the world, especially in the South, totally different story.
Oh, I bet. Even with those laws, the reality for black folks must have been so tough. You read about the Freedmen's Bureau trying to help. But
underfunded, under attack constantly. People don't want to give up that power, that control they had before. And then sharecropping, tenant farming, it's like slavery with extra steps. Keeps black folks trapped in debt, dependent on white landowners.
And to make things even worse, you've got the KKK and others just terrorizing black communities. Violence, intimidation, trying to undermine any progress made. It's sickening.
It's heartbreaking. And in the end, all that hope, all that effort, kind of gets swept aside with the compromise of 1877. Federal troops pull out of the South, Reconstruction's done.
Over.
Yeah.
Like that. Man, that's got to be a turning point for the worse, right?
It is. White Southerners regain control. Jim Crow laws start popping up, basically legalizing segregation. Black folks get pushed back down, denied their rights, and this. This sets the stage for a whole century of injustice. The echoes of that are still felt today.
Yeah, it's a rough reminder that progress ain't always a straight line,
Yeah.
Even when you think things are changing for the better.
It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of deal. Speaking of steps forward, though,
Yeah.
The late 1800s, right? Massive shift. The whole Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, all that. Mansions, monopolies, those robber barons. It's almost cartoonish, right? Oh, it was a time for excess, that's for sure. But like you said, it's also about massive change. Technology's booming, cities are exploding with people looking for work, immigrants mostly, opportunities there, but also exploitation, inequality, the whole deal.
So it's like the best of times, worst of times, all smashed together. And then you got this, like, literal connection happening. The Transcontinental Railroad, 1869, boom, coast to coast, changes everything.
Changes everything, yeah, but again, at what cost? You're talking back-breaking labor, mostly Chinese immigrants, dangerous conditions, discrimination, and of course, Native Americans getting pushed further and further aside as settlers move west. That part often gets forgotten.
It's easy to focus on the shiny new thing, not the folks who paid the price for it. And then on top of that, you've got these, like, mythical figures from Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt. I mean, they built empires, but
They also crushed anyone in their way. That's where monopolies and trusts come in. These guys, they could control entire industries, set prices, crush competition. It's wealth concentrated at the very top, while a lot of folks are barely scraping by.
yeah, and from what I was reading, people started to notice, started to get angry. Labor movements start gaining steam, right? Workers demanding better conditions, better pay, the right to organize.
It's a fight, that's for sure. And sometimes it got violent. The Haymarket affair in Chicago, the Pullman strike. These are flashpoints, show just how much tension there was. The Haymarket one especially, it becomes this symbol for workers' rights, but also police brutality.
So the government's got to step in at some point, right? How do they deal with these giant corporations?
Well, they try. 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act gets passed. Meant to break up monopolies, curb that kind of power. Good idea, but it takes a while for it to actually have teeth. Government's still figuring out how to handle this new economic landscape.
It's a start, right? Like laying the groundwork for what comes next. Is that where the progressive era fits in?
Yeah, you could say that. All those problems from the Gilded Age, the inequality, the worker struggles, it creates this need for change. And the progressives, they're ready to tackle it head on.
Okay, so unpack that a bit. What's the progressive era all about? From what I read, it's like this wave of activism, reform, touching everything from food safety to, well, women's right to vote.
You got it. It's this feeling that things got to change, and a whole bunch of folks are stepping up to make it happen. Journalists, writers, activists, everyday people, they're called the muckrakers, which I know sounds kind of gross.
Yeah, not exactly a compliment, huh?
But it fit. These folks, they dug up all the dirt, exposed the corruption, the injustice. Upton Sinclair, for example, his novel, The Jungle, that thing blew the lid off the meatpacking industry.
Yeah, I remember reading that in school. Pretty graphic stuff.
Yeah.
It led to some actual laws, right?
It did. Food safety laws, the whole deal. That's the power of, like, shining a light on the bad stuff. Public outrage can move mountains sometimes.
And women were a big part of this movement, right? Like leading the charge on a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. Ida B. Wells fighting against lynching, Jane Addams helping immigrants in Chicago. These women were powerhouses, challenging norms, demanding equality, pushing for their voices to be heard.
Which brings us to the big one, right? Women's suffrage. Decades of fighting for the right to vote. And finally, in 1920, boom, the 19th Amendment. Victory.
Huge victory. And it didn't come easy. Those women were relentless, organized, and they changed the course of history. Makes you think about what's possible when people band together for a cause they believe in.
It's inspiring stuff. What about the presidents during this time? Were they on board with all this change?
To varying degrees, yeah. Teddy Roosevelt, he was all about busting trusts, regulating big business, his square deal thing. Then Woodrow Wilson, he's got his new freedom platform, also tackling monopolies, banking reform, the whole 9 yards.
So both of them basically trying to rein in the excesses of the Gilded Age, use the power of the government to, like, protect the little guy.
Exactly. They might not agree on the how, but they both see a role for government in fixing things.
It's interesting how that idea keeps popping up, right? Government power versus individual freedom, always a balancing act. But was there anything the progressive era, like, missed? Were there any blind spots?
That's a good question. Even with the best intentions, there are definitely some areas where it fell short, like racial equality. Some progressives, while pushing for reforms, also held some pretty racist views.
Yeah. Progress ain't always pretty. It's a reminder that even good movements can have, like, unintended consequences.
And as we move into the early 1900s, America's stepping onto the world stage in a whole new way, expanding its influence, getting involved in global affairs. And it all leads to a conflict nobody saw coming.
World War I, that's a whole other can of worms, right? From 1898 to 1919, America goes from expanding its territory to getting tangled up in a war that reshapes the entire world.
It's a time of ambition, of both good intentions and, well, some not so good ones. America's figuring out its place in the world, and it ain't always pretty.
Okay, let's break it down. Starting with the Spanish-American War, 1898. Short war, but some pretty big outcomes, right?
Huge outcomes. The U.S. becomes a global power practically overnight. Gets Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, even annexes Hawaii, which, by the way, had its own messy history.
So what's the motivation here? Just spreading democracy, or is it more about, like, power grabs and resources?
It's a mix, honestly. There's this genuine belief in American exceptionalism, this idea that we got to spread our values. But also, yeah, there's strategy involved, naval bases, access to markets, competing with other empires. It's all tangled up together.
Sounds like the debate over imperialism was raging back then, just like it is today.
Oh, absolutely. And the legacy of that time period, it's still something we're grappling with. What does it mean to be a global power? What responsibility do we have to the places we influence? Those questions don't have easy answers.
And then you've got the Panama Canal, another one of those massive engineering feats. Connects the Atlantic and Pacific, changes global trade forever.
But again, at a cost. Thousands of workers die during construction, disease, dangerous conditions. Plus, the whole political maneuvering to get it built, the U.S. meddling in Panama's affairs, it's complicated.
Seems like every step forward comes with a whole bunch of baggage. And while America's busy building canals and expanding its reach, Europe's about to explode. 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated, and boom, World War I.
It's like a domino effect, Alliances, old grudges, all this tension just boils over. Millions die, empires crumble. It's a turning point for the whole world.
And the U.S. tries to stay out of it, but eventually, in 1917, we're in. Big shift from our usual stay out of Europe's mess policy.
Yeah, it's a huge decision. And it changes things back home, too. Rationing, propaganda, even limits on free speech. It's wartime, and things get, well, messy.
It's crazy how war can change a society so fast, even one that prides itself on freedom and all that.
It shows you where the cracks are, the tension between security and liberty. It's always there, just below the surface.
So 1918, war's over, Allies win. But the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, that's a whole other issue. Germany gets punished hard, reparations, loss of territory. Some say that's what paved the way for World War II.
It definitely didn't help. Created a lot of resentment, instability. And then the U.S., we back away from the League of Nations, this new international organization meant to prevent future wars.
So even after all that, we're still hesitant to take on a leadership role, huh?
There's this push and pull, wanting to be involved, but also wanting to stay out of it. It's a theme that comes up again and again in U.S. history.
And back home, things are changing fast. The Roaring Twenties are about to kick off, and it's a whole new world. Economy's booming, culture's shifting, jazz is everywhere. But like you said, there's always more to the story.
Always. Get ready for flappers, speakeasies, the Harlem Renaissance, but also, the cracks in the system that lead to the Great Depression. That's where we're headed next.
Okay, so the Roaring Twenties, it's like the image is so strong, right? Flapper dresses, those parties, jazz music. It feels almost like a movie,
It's definitely romanticized, that's for sure. But yeah, there's this energy, this sense of change, breaking free from the old ways. It's exciting stuff.
But it wasn't all fun and games, right? I mean, Prohibition kicks off in 1920, 18th Amendment, no more booze. Good idea in theory, maybe, but did it actually work?
It's tricky. Alcohol consumption did go down overall, but it also created this whole underground culture. Bootleggers, gangsters, speakeasies. It's like they tried to outlaw fun, and people just found new ways to have it.
Human's gonna human, right?
Yeah.
Always finding a workaround. And meanwhile, you've got this economic boon happening, but it's not reaching everyone. Farmers are struggling. Some industrial workers are still in rough shape.
The prosperity was very uneven. The cities were roaring, but rural America was getting left behind. It's a theme that comes up a lot, that gap between the haves and have-nots.
And then, in the middle of all this, you've got the Harlem Renaissance happening. This explosion of black art, music, literature. It's inspiring stuff.
It is. You've got Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington. They're creating this new, vibrant culture, challenging stereotypes, celebrating Black identity. It's powerful stuff.
It's like this reminder that even when things are tough, even when there's injustice all around, people find ways to create, to express themselves, to push for change.
Absolutely. The Harlem Renaissance was this beacon of hope, but it's also important to remember it's happening alongside Jim Crow laws, segregation, discrimination. The fight for equality is far from over.
Yeah, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back all the time. And then, bam,
Yeah.
1929, the stock market crashes and the party's over. The Great Depression hits, and it's like nothing anyone's ever seen.
It was devastating. Millions lose their jobs, homes, savings. Those images of bread lines, of Hoovervilles, those shanty towns, it's a stark reminder of how fragile things can be.
And Hoover, the president this time, he gets a lot of flack for his response, right? Like, he just didn't grasp how bad it was, how much help people needed.
His approach was very hands-off, limited government intervention. But the scale of the Depression, it demanded something different, something bolder. And that's where FDR comes in with his New Deal. But that's another story for another time.
Man, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the Civil War to the Roaring Twenties, the Depression looming. It's amazing how it all connects, how one thing leads to another.
That's the thing about history, right? It's not just dates and names. It's about understanding how we got here, the choices people made, the forces that shaped the world we live in.
And those forces, they're still at work today. It's
Yeah.
like studying history gives you this, like, roadmap, not to predict the future, but to understand the present better.
Exactly. It helps us ask better questions, see those patterns, avoid making the same mistakes, and hopefully build a better future because of it.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's always amazing to me how much there is to learn, how many stories there are to uncover, and like always, we just scratched the surface here.
There's always more to explore, more to discover. That's what makes history so fascinating, right? It's a never-ending journey.
So to everyone listening, keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep discovering those connections. You never know what you might find.